Welcome to another exploration into the darker corners of American history, stories that remain as mysterious as they are unsettling. Before we begin, take a moment to let us know in the comments where you're watching from and what time of day or night this narration has reached you. It's always intriguing to see how far these accounts travel and when they find their audience. With that said, let's journey back into the past. The year was 1901, and the Missouri Ozarks stood as a testament to both God's majesty and mankind's determination. These ancient hills, worn smooth by countless millennia, held secrets in their limestone caves and whispered stories through their dense forests of oak and hickory. It was a land where faith ran as deep as the spring-fed creeks, where Baptist and Methodist congregations dotted the hollows like scattered lanterns in the wilderness, and where the line between the sacred and the supernatural often blurred in the mountain mist. In this rugged landscape, where the nearest neighbor might be miles away and the closest doctor even farther, communities bound themselves together with threads of shared hardship and unwavering faith. Churches weren't just places of worship. They were the beating heart of social life, the center where news was shared, marriages celebrated, and sorrows comforted. These simple wooden structures, often built by the calloused hands of their own congregations, served as both sanctuary and gathering place in a land that could be as unforgiving as it was beautiful. West Plains, Missouri, had established itself as one of the larger settlements in the region by 1901, boasting nearly 1,000 souls and serving as a hub for the scattered farming communities throughout the southern Missouri Ozarks. To the south, Harrison, Arkansas, stood as another beacon of civilization, its courthouse square bustling with merchants and farmers who traveled from the farthest reaches of the mountains to conduct their business. Between these two towns stretched miles of wilderness, broken only by small settlements, family farms, and the occasional country church that served the spiritual needs of the scattered faithful. It was in this wild and beautiful country that the Hartwell family had made their home. Thomas Hartwell, a sturdy man of 48, with hands that spoke of decades spent working the rocky Ozark soil, had carved out a modest but prosperous farm in a valley about 15 miles northeast of West Plains. His wife, Rebecca, possessed the quiet strength that mountain women cultivated from necessity, managing a household while helping with the endless demands of farm life. Their children, Jonathan, 23, and already showing promise as a preacher himself; Sarah, 19, and known throughout the county for her beautiful voice during Sunday services; Mary, 16, and possessed of a quiet wisdom beyond her years; and young Samuel, barely 13, but already capable of handling a plow team, completed a family that had earned respect throughout the region. The Hartwells weren't wealthy by any measure, but they were rich in the things that mattered most to their community: faith, hard work, and generosity. Their farmhouse, built of local timber and chinked with Ozark clay, sat nestled in a valley where Willow Creek meandered through stands of white oak and black walnut. The land provided well for those willing to work it. Corn grew tall in the bottom land, hogs fattened on acorns in the oak groves, and Rebecca's garden supplied vegetables that she shared generously with neighbors in need. But it was Thomas Hartwell's reputation as a lay preacher that truly set the family apart. When the circuit rider couldn't make it through in winter, when a family needed comfort in times of sorrow, or when the community simply felt the need to gather in worship, folks knew they could count on Thomas. His voice, weathered by years of calling cattle and reading scripture, could fill even the largest gathering with the kind of conviction that made hardened farmers weep and young people commit their lives to the Lord. The autumn of 1901 had painted the Ozark Hills in their finest dress. Maples blazed scarlet against the golden backdrop of oak and hickory, while the ever-present pines provided dark green anchors in the rolling landscape. It was a season of harvest and thanksgiving, of preparation for the long winter ahead, and of reflection on God's provision through another year. The corn had been good, the hogs were fat, and most families faced the coming cold months with full larders and warm hearts. It was during this season of abundance that Thomas Hartwell felt called to host what he termed a fellowship gathering at the small church that served his community. The building itself was nothing grand, a simple rectangular structure of rough-hewn logs with a shake roof and 3 windows on each side. But it had been built with love and dedication by the very people who worshipped within its walls, and to them it was as sacred as any cathedral. The Willow Creek Baptist Church, as it had come to be known, sat on a small rise about 2 miles from the Hartwell farm, surrounded by a grove of ancient oaks that provided blessed shade during summer services. The building could hold perhaps 60 people if they packed in tight, and on this particular October evening, Thomas had reason to believe it would be full. Word had spread throughout the scattered community that there would be singing, preaching, and a shared meal afterward, the kind of gathering that brought neighbors together and strengthened the bonds that held these isolated communities together. Rebecca had spent the better part of a week preparing for the event. The smokehouse had yielded its finest ham, the garden. Ann had provided its last tomatoes and late beans, and she had traded eggs in West Plains for sugar to make her famous apple pies. Sarah and Mary had helped with the cooking, their excitement building as they anticipated an evening of fellowship with friends they might not see again until spring made travel easier. As the sun began its descent behind the western hills on October 12, 1901, families began making their way toward the little church. The Hendersons arrived first, their wagon loaded with children and covered dishes. Old Samuel Henderson, at 71, still the acknowledged patriarch of his family, had walked these hills since before the war between the states, and his weathered face crinkled into a smile as he helped his wife down from their wagon. "Evening, Brother Thomas," he called out, using the familiar title that mountain folk reserved for men they respected. "Looks to be a fine night for praising the Lord." Thomas emerged from the church where he had been lighting the oil lamps that would provide illumination for the evening's activities. The warm glow spilled from the windows into the gathering dusk, creating pools of yellow light that seemed to push back not just the darkness, but the wild loneliness that could settle over these mountains like a shroud. "Indeed it is, Brother Samuel," Thomas replied, clasping the older man's hand with genuine warmth. "Rebecca's got enough food cooking to feed half the county, and I suspect we'll have enough voices here tonight to raise the roof." The Hendersons were soon joined by the Coopers, a young family who had only recently settled in the area after making the difficult journey from Tennessee. Behind them came the Millers, whose farm lay in the next valley over, and the Simmons family, who had traveled nearly 8 miles through winding mountain paths to attend the gathering. As full darkness settled over the hills, more families continued to arrive. The Edwards clan came in force, grandfather, parents, and 5 children ranging in age from 6 to 18. The Pratts brought their famous cornbread and their twin boys, known throughout the community for their ability to harmonize any hymn. Even the Washingtons, one of the few colored families in the area, made the journey from their small farm near the river, carrying their infant daughter and a pot of beans that Rebecca knew would be perfectly seasoned and eagerly welcomed. By 7 o'clock, the little church was indeed packed to capacity. Oil lamps flickered on the simple wooden altar, casting dancing shadows on the rough log walls. The smell of burning whale oil mingled with the aromas of food warming on the wood stove in the back corner, and the sound of neighborly conversation filled the space with warmth and life. Thomas took his place at the simple wooden podium that served as a pulpit, his worn Bible open before him. Rebecca sat in the front pew with their children, her face glowing with the satisfaction of seeing their community come together in fellowship. The gathering represented more than a simple church service. It was an affirmation of the bonds that held these scattered families together in a landscape that could be both beautiful and brutally unforgiving. "Friends," Thomas began, his voice carrying easily to every corner of the packed building, "we've come together tonight to thank our Creator for His bounty, to seek His guidance for the days ahead, and to strengthen the ties that bind us as neighbors and believers. Let us begin by raising our voices in praise." Sarah Hartwell's clear soprano led them into "Amazing Grace," and soon the entire congregation had joined in. The familiar words, sung by voices that carried the accent and cadence of the mountains, seemed to fill not just the church, but the entire valley with sound. Outside, the October wind stirred the oak leaves, adding nature's own harmony to the human voices within. As the evening progressed, the gathering took on the character that made such events precious to rural communities. After the singing and a brief but heartfelt sermon from Thomas about gratitude and community, the congregation moved into the informal sharing of food and fellowship that was often the most treasured part of such gatherings. Children who saw each other only occasionally during harsh winter months renewed friendships and made plans for hunting expeditions and fishing trips. Women shared recipes, remedies, and news of family members who lived in distant parts. Men discussed crops, weather, and the endless challenges of wresting a living from the rocky Ozark soil. But as the evening wore on, a subtle change began to settle over the gathering, so gradual at first that no one could later say exactly when it began. Perhaps it was young Mary Hartwell who first noticed that the wind outside had grown unusually strong, rattling the church windows with a persistence that seemed almost intentional. Or maybe it was old Samuel Henderson, whose weathered senses, sharpened by decades of reading the moods of nature, detected something in the air that made him unconsciously move closer to his wife. The first truly unsettling moment came when the oil lamps began to flicker in unison, their flames dancing wildly despite the absence of any drafts within the church. Rebecca noticed it first, her mother's instincts alert to any potential danger in a building filled with her neighbors and children. She caught Thomas's eye and nodded toward the lamps, but before he could respond, the flames steadied again, burning with their previous calm consistency. "Probably just the wind," murmured Reverend James Fletcher, who had ridden down from West Plains to attend the gathering. Fletcher was an educated man, having completed his theological training at a seminary in Kentucky, and he tended to view unusual occurrences through the lens of rational explanation. But even he seemed slightly unsettled by the synchronized behavior of the lamps. It was then that Sarah Hartwell, her young face pale in the lamplight, spoke words that would haunt the survivors for the rest of their lives. "Papa, listen. Do you hear that?" The conversation in the church gradually stilled as people strained to hear what had caught Sarah's attention. At first, there was only the sound of wind in the trees and the distant hoot of an owl. But then, carried on the night air from somewhere in the darkness beyond the church, came a sound that made every person in that building feel a chill that had nothing to do with the October weather. It was singing. Not the joyful hymns that had filled the church earlier in the evening, but something else entirely. A low, haunting melody that seemed to drift through the trees like mist. The voices, if voices they were, carried no words that could be understood, only a mournful cadence that rose and fell with an almost hypnotic rhythm. "What in tarnation?" began Tom Miller. But his words trailed off as the strange music grew louder, seeming to circle the church like a living thing. Thomas Hartwell, his face grave with concern, moved to one of the windows and peered out into the darkness. The moon, nearly full, cast enough light to illuminate the grove of oaks surrounding the church, but he could see no source for the mysterious singing. The melody continued, now joined by what sounded like the rhythm of feet, dozens of feet, moving through the fallen leaves. "Perhaps we should conclude our gathering," suggested Reverend Fletcher, his educated reserve clearly shaken by the inexplicable sounds. "It's grown quite late, and folks have a long journey home." But even as he spoke, the singing stopped abruptly, leaving a silence so complete that it seemed to press against the walls of the little church. No wind stirred the trees, no owl called from the darkness, no cricket chirped its autumn song. The silence was so profound that it seemed alive, a presence that surrounded the church and waited with infinite patience. Rebecca Hartwell gathered her children closer, her maternal instincts fully alert now. Something was wrong, terribly wrong, but she couldn't identify what it was. The men in the congregation had moved instinctively toward the windows, their faces serious as they tried to peer into the darkness beyond. "Could be travelers," suggested John Cooper, though his voice lacked conviction. "Maybe folks lost in the dark, singing to keep their spirits up." "At this hour?" replied Samuel Henderson, his 71 years of mountain wisdom telling him that whatever lurked in the darkness was not composed of lost travelers. "And with no light?" "No, sir. Something else entirely." As if summoned by his words, a new sound emerged from the night, the unmistakable crack of breaking branches, as if something large was moving through the forest around the church. Not the casual movement of deer or other wildlife, but deliberate, purposeful sounds that spoke of intelligence and intent. Thomas made a decision that would later be debated by survivors and investigators alike. Rather than barricading the congregation inside the church, he moved to the door and called out into the darkness. "Hello out there! If you're in need of help or shelter, you're welcome to join us." His words seemed to be swallowed by the night, producing no response except the continuation of the breaking branches, now moving in what sounded like a complete circle around the church. The oil lamps flickered again, more violently this time, and one of them went out entirely, plunging a corner of the church into deep shadow. It was in that moment of partial darkness that young Samuel Hartwell, pressing his face against one of the windows, let out a gasp that made everyone in the church turn toward him. "Papa," he whispered. Dee, his 13-year-old voice tight with fear, "There's someone out there. But they're not right." Before Thomas could reach his son's side, the boy stumbled backward from the window, his face pale as milk in the lamplight. "Their eyes," he stammered. "Their eyes are like burning coals." The congregation pressed toward the windows, desperate to see what had terrified the boy, but the darkness beyond seemed to have grown even deeper, as if the night itself was pressing against the glass. The breaking branches had stopped, replaced by a new sound, the soft scrape of feet moving across the wooden porch that ran along the front of the church. Reverend Fletcher, drawing upon his theological training, began to speak in a loud, clear voice. "Whatever manner of beings you may be, know that this is a house of God, and those within are under His protection." His words were answered by a sound that no one in that church would ever forget. Laughter that was not quite human, echoing from multiple throats and seeming to come from all directions at once. It was not the laughter of joy or even of mockery, but something far more unsettling. The laughter of beings who found human attempts at divine protection amusing rather than threatening. The front door of the church, secured with a simple wooden latch, began to rattle as something tried the handle from outside. When the latch held, the rattling grew more violent, accompanied by a scratching sound that suggested claws rather than human fingers. "The back door," whispered Rebecca urgently. But even as she spoke, similar sounds began coming from the rear of the church. Whatever surrounded them had obviously planned their approach carefully, cutting off any possibility of escape. The oil lamps flickered once more, and this time all but one went out simultaneously, plunging the church into near total darkness. In that darkness, the congregation huddled together, parents clutching children, men moving protectively toward their families, everyone straining to understand what manner of threat surrounded them. It was then that the most terrifying sound of all began. The slow, deliberate removal of the wooden boards that had been nailed over the broken window at the back of the church. The congregation listened in horrified silence as their unseen tormentors worked with methodical patience, prying away each board with a care that suggested they had unlimited time and absolute confidence in their ultimate success. "Whatever happens," Thomas whispered to his wife, his voice barely audible above the sound of splintering wood, "keep the children close. Don't let them see." But Rebecca's response was cut short by a new development that filled the church with an even deeper dread. The singing had returned, but now it came from inside the church itself. Somewhere in the darkness among the huddled congregation, voices that belonged to no one present began to weave a melody that seemed to pull at the very souls of those who heard it. The song spoke of loneliness and wandering, of souls lost between worlds, of hunger that could never be satisfied by earthly sustenance. As it grew louder, some members of the congregation began to sway unconsciously to its rhythm, their eyes growing distant and unfocused. "Don't listen," Reverend Fletcher commanded, his voice cutting through the hypnotic melody. "Cover your ears. It's trying to entrance you." But his warning came too late for some. Mary Cooper, the young mother who had traveled from Tennessee with her family, rose from her seat and began walking toward the back of the church, her movements dreamlike and purposeful. Her husband reached for her, but she moved with a strength that belied her slight frame, pushing past his grasping hands toward whatever waited in the darkness. "Mary!" John Cooper's anguished cry seemed to break through her trance for a moment, and she turned toward him with an expression of such profound sorrow that several women in the congregation began to weep. "They're so lonely, John," she said, in a voice that was her own and yet not her own. "They've been waiting so long. They just want to come home." Before anyone could stop her, she had reached the broken window and was beginning to climb through it into the darkness beyond. The last anyone saw of Mary Cooper was her face, pale and peaceful, disappearing into the night as if she were diving into deep, dark water. John Cooper lunged after his wife, but strong hands held him back. Through the broken window came the sound of Mary's voice, singing now in harmony with the unearthly chorus, growing fainter as she moved away from the church and deeper into the surrounding forest. The congregation was in chaos now. Children were crying, women were praying aloud, and men were arguing about whether to attempt a rescue or to barricade themselves more securely within the church. But their debate was interrupted by a new sound, the soft thud of something heavy being dragged across the wooden floor. In the dim light of the single remaining oil lamp, they could see that it was Samuel Henderson. The 71-year-old patriarch was unconscious, his breathing shallow, being pulled across the floor by invisible hands toward the broken window. His wife screamed and threw herself across his body, but she too began to slide across the floor as if some irresistible force was drawing them both toward the darkness outside. "The rope!" shouted Tom Miller. "Get the rope from the bell!" Several men scrambled to secure the rope that was used to ring the church bell, and they managed to loop it around Samuel Henderson's ankles just as his head and shoulders disappeared through the window. For a moment, it seemed as if they might save him. The rope grew taut, and his unconscious form stopped moving toward the forest. But then the rope began to fray, each strand parting with a sound like a rifle shot. Whatever force was pulling Samuel Henderson was far stronger than the combined efforts of half a dozen grown men. The rope snapped, and both Samuel and his wife vanished into the darkness beyond the window. The congregation was trapped now, surrounded by forces they could neither see nor understand, watching helplessly as their friends and neighbors disappeared one by one into a night that seemed to have developed an appetite for human souls. The singing continued, sometimes from within the church, sometimes from the forest, sometimes seeming to come from the very air around them. Thomas Hartwell, his face grim with determination, gathered his family around him. "We're going to make a run for it," he whispered urgently. "All of us together, straight for the horses. Don't stop for anything. Don't look back, and don't listen to anything you might hear." But even as he formulated his desperate plan, the front door of the church swung open with a creak that seemed to echo through the night. No one stood in the doorway, only darkness that seemed to flow into the church like a living thing, extinguishing the last oil lamp and plunging the congregation into complete blackness. In that darkness, chaos erupted. People screamed, stumbled, and called out for loved ones they could no longer see. The supernatural singing grew louder, seeming to come from everywhere at once, and the sound of dragging bodies across the wooden floor resumed with terrible intensity. When dawn finally broke over the Ozark Hills on October 13, 1901, it illuminated a scene that would become legend in the region for generations to come. The Willow Creek Baptist Church sat peacefully in its grove of oak trees, its windows reflecting the morning sun, its door standing open to reveal an interior that appeared completely normal. But the people were gone, all of them. Not a single member of the congregation that had gathered for fellowship on that October evening was ever seen again. 43 souls had vanished as completely as if they had never existed, leaving behind only the faintest traces of their presence, a few scattered hymn books, some overturned benches, and a pot of beans still warm on the wood stove. The first to discover the empty church was a traveling merchant named William Hayes, who had been making his regular circuit through the mountain communities and had stopped to water his horse at Willow Creek. Seeing the church door standing open, he had called out a greeting, expecting to find early rising worshippers preparing for morning prayers. Instead, he found silence and emptiness so complete that it seemed to have weight and substance. Hayes, a practical man who had seen his share of frontier hardships, later told investigators that stepping into that empty church was like walking into a tomb, not because of anything he could see, but because of what he could feel. It was like the very air had been sucked out of the place, he reported to Sheriff William Crawford of West Plains. Not just the people were gone, it was like their souls had been pulled right out of existence. Sheriff Crawford, a veteran of frontier law enforcement who had dealt with everything from claim jumpers to fugitive outlaws, found himself faced with a mystery unlike anything in his experience. 43 people did not simply vanish without a trace, especially not from the middle of a church service. There had to be a rational explanation. His initial investigation revealed a few disturbing details. The horses and wagons that had brought the congregation to the church were still there, tethered peacefully in the grove where their owners had left them. None showed signs of distress or struggle, and they had apparently stood patiently through the night, waiting for masters who would never return. Inside the church, Crawford found evidence of the gathering. Food still laid out on tables, children's toys forgotten under benches, and personal items like shawls and pocket watches left behind by their owners. But there were no signs of violence, no bloodstains, no evidence of forced entry or struggle. Most disturbing of all were the hymn books. They lay scattered across the floor in a pattern that seemed almost deliberate, open to pages that told a story no one wanted to read. "Nearer, my God, to thee" lay open near the altar. "In the sweet by and by" was spread across the center aisle, and near the broken window at the back of the church, a hymnal was open to "When We All Get to Heaven," its pages fluttering in the morning breeze. Crawford expanded his investigation, bringing in help from neighboring counties and even requesting assistance from federal marshals. They scoured every inch of the surrounding forest, followed every creek and hollow, and questioned every resident within a 50-mile radius. But the investigation yielded nothing more substantial than rumors and speculation. Some claimed to have heard strange singing in the woods on the night of the disappearance. Others reported seeing lights moving through the trees in areas where no lights should have been. A few brave souls ventured deep into the forest, following paths that seemed to lead nowhere and calling out names that echoed unanswered through the hills. The federal marshals, trained in tracking and investigation, found the case particularly baffling. 43 people don't just evaporate, Marshal James Sullivan reported to his superiors, even if they had all decided to leave together. Which makes no sense given that they included entire families with small children. We would have found tracks, abandoned campsites, something. It's as if they walked into that church and stepped out of the world. As the investigation dragged on through the winter months, theories began to emerge from the mountain communities. Some believed that the congregation had been taken by hostile Indians, though no tribe in the region had been active for decades, and there was no evidence of violence or struggle. Others suggested that the entire group had fallen victim to some natural disaster, a cave-in perhaps, or a flash flood that had swept them all away. But these rational explanations failed to account for the horses left behind, the food still warm on the stove, and the complete absence of any disturbance in the surrounding area. As spring returned to the Ozarks in 1902, the official investigation was quietly closed, filed away as an unsolved case that defied conventional explanation. It was then that the unofficial stories began to emerge, whispered tales that spread through the mountain communities like smoke through trees. Mary Washington, the wife of one of the disappeared, had left her infant daughter with her mother that night, planning to return after the church gathering. The baby survived, but she would grow up with an unusual gift, the ability to hear singing in places where no singers should be. Old-timers began to report strange occurrences in the vicinity of the abandoned church. Travelers passing through the area at night spoke of hearing hymns drifting through the trees, always just at the edge of perception, always seeming to come from the direction of the empty building. Some claimed to see lights moving through the windows of the church on certain nights, especially when the moon was dark and the October wind stirred the oak leaves. The building itself seemed to resist human habitation. Attempts to hold services there were unsuccessful. Oil lamps would flicker and die, songbooks would fly open to random pages, and congregation members would find themselves overwhelmed with an inexplicable sadness that made worship impossible. Eventually, the church was abandoned entirely, left to the elements and the increasingly wild stories that surrounded it. Reverend Fletcher's replacement, a young minister named David Morrison, who arrived from Arkansas in 1903, made several attempts to understand what had happened to his predecessor. He interviewed survivors from surrounding communities, studied the physical evidence that remained, and even spent several nights alone in the church, hoping to experience firsthand whatever had claimed the missing congregation. Morrison's written account of those nights, preserved in the archives of the Arkansas Baptist State Convention, provides one of the most detailed descriptions of the phenomena that continued to manifest at the site. On the evening of October 12, 1903, exactly 2 years after the disappearance, I entered the church at sunset and prepared to spend the night in prayer and contemplation. I had brought with me an oil lamp, my Bible, and a determination to understand what had befallen Brother Fletcher and his congregation. As darkness fell, I began to experience sensations that I can only describe as profoundly unsettling. The air within the church seemed to grow heavy, as if a storm were approaching, though the night outside was clear and still. My oil lamp began to flicker erratically, despite the absence of any drafts or disturbances. At approximately 11 o'clock, I began to hear what can only be described as singing. It started as a whisper, so faint that I initially dismissed it as the wind in the eaves. But gradually it grew louder and more distinct until I could make out the melody of Amazing Grace being sung by what sounded like a full congregation. The voices were hauntingly beautiful, but there was something wrong with them, a quality that made my skin crawl and my heart race. With inexplicable fear, they seemed to come from all around me, as if the walls themselves were singing. But when I called out, asking who was there, the music stopped abruptly, leaving a silence so complete that I could hear my own heartbeat. This pattern continued throughout the night. The singing would begin softly, grow in volume and complexity, then stop the moment I attempted to interact with it. As dawn approached, I found myself gripped by an overwhelming urge to walk outside, to follow the music to its source in the forest beyond. Only by constant prayer and recitation of Scripture was I able to resist this compulsion. When morning came, I examined the church and found that my Bible had been moved during the night. It now lay open to Revelation chapter 20. And the sea gave up the dead which were in it, and death and hell delivered up the dead which were in them, and they were judged every man according to their works. I do not claim to understand what I experienced that night, but I am convinced that the disappearance of the Willow Creek congregation was no ordinary tragedy. Something dwells in that place, something that hungers for human souls and possesses the power to take them. Morrison's account was largely dismissed by church authorities as the product of an overwrought imagination, but his experience marked the beginning of a pattern that would continue for decades. Every few years, someone would attempt to solve the mystery of the missing congregation, drawn by curiosity or scholarly interest to the empty church in its grove of ancient oaks. Most came away with nothing more than a sense of unease and a story about unexplained sounds or fleeting shadows. But a very few, emerged from their encounters fundamentally changed, speaking of experiences that challenged everything they thought they knew about the nature of reality. Dr. Margaret Sullivan, a professor of folklore at the University of Arkansas, visited the site in 1925 as part of her research into Ozark legends and superstitions. Her academic training had prepared her to approach such stories with skepticism, to seek rational explanations for phenomena that local people attributed to supernatural causes. But her week-long stay in the area, during which she interviewed dozens of local residents and spent 2 nights in the abandoned church, convinced her that the Willow Creek disappearance was unlike any case in the folklore literature. "The consistency of the reports is remarkable," she wrote in her unpublished notes, now housed in the University of Arkansas Special Collections. Over the course of 24 years, witnesses from different backgrounds and with no opportunity to coordinate their stories have described nearly identical experiences. The sound of congregational singing from an empty building, the sensation of being watched by unseen presences, and an overwhelming compulsion to enter the forest around the church. Most significantly, several witnesses have reported seeing figures moving through the trees on dark nights. Figures that appear to be dressed in early 20th century clothing, walking in small groups as if making their way to some distant destination. When approached, these figures vanish like smoke, but the witnesses consistently describe a sense of profound sadness emanating from them, as if they are lost souls searching for something they can never find. Dr. Sullivan's research was cut short when she herself experienced what she later described as a supernatural encounter of such intensity that it shook my faith in the rational world. On her final night at the church, she reported being awakened by the sound of a full congregation singing "When We All Get to Heaven," the same hymn that had been found open in the scattered songbooks after the original disappearance. I opened my eyes to find the church filled with pale, translucent figures, she wrote in her private journal. Men, women, and children, dressed in the simple clothing of rural folk, all facing the altar, where a figure I somehow knew to be Thomas Hartwell was conducting their ghostly service. They appeared to be singing with great joy, their faces radiant with an otherworldly peace. But when they became aware of my presence, their expressions changed to ones of infinite sadness. Thomas Hartwell approached me, and though his lips did not move, I heard his voice as clearly as if he had spoken aloud. "Tell them we are still here. Tell them we are still waiting." The vision lasted only moments, but when it faded, I found myself outside the church, standing in the grove of oaks, with no memory of how I had gotten there. The eastern sky was beginning to lighten with dawn, and birds were singing their morning songs. But the silence from the church behind me was so complete that it seemed to absorb all other sound. Dr. Sullivan left the area the following day and never returned. Her research notes on the Willow Creek case were sealed with instructions that they not be opened until 50 years after her death. When they were finally made available to researchers in 1978, they provided the most detailed academic study of the disappearance ever conducted. But perhaps the most poignant testimony about the fate of the missing congregation came from an unexpected source. Sarah Washington, the infant daughter of the disappeared couple, who had grown up in the care of her grandmother and displayed throughout her life an unusual sensitivity to supernatural phenomena. In 1951, on the 50th anniversary of the disappearance, Sarah, now a woman of 50, made a pilgrimage to the abandoned church. She had avoided the place throughout her childhood and adult life, despite her grandmother, the stories about her parents, and the tragic night that had made her an orphan. But as she approached her own old age, Sarah felt compelled to visit the site where her parents had vanished, perhaps hoping to find some sense of closure or understanding. What she discovered there would provide the most complete account of what had happened on that October night in 1901. Sarah arrived at the church as the sun was setting on October 12, 1951, exactly 50 years after the disappearance. The building had deteriorated significantly over the decades, its roof partially collapsed, its windows broken, and its walls covered with the encroaching vines of the surrounding forest. But as she approached the structure, she began to hear the sound that had haunted her dreams since childhood, the distant singing of voices she somehow recognized as belonging to people she had never met. Unlike previous witnesses, Sarah did not flee from the sounds or attempt to rational them away. Instead, she entered the ruined church and called out to the darkness, "Mama? Papa? I'm here. It's Sarah, your baby girl." What happened next was witnessed by no one else, but Sarah's account, recorded shortly before her death in 1987, provides the most detailed description of the supernatural events at Willow Creek. The moment I spoke their names, the ruins around me began to shimmer and change. The broken walls became whole again, the collapsed roof repaired itself, and oil lamps flickered to life throughout the building. I found myself standing in the church as it had been on that October night 50 years before, surrounded by the congregation that had vanished. They were all there, every person who had disappeared that night. I recognized them from old photographs and from descriptions my grandmother had shared with me throughout my childhood. They appeared solid and real, dressed in their Sunday finest, ban. But there was something ethereal about them, as if they were made of moonlight and memory rather than flesh and blood. My parents were at the front of the group, my mother beautiful and young as she had been when I was born, my father tall and dignified in his best suit. When they saw me, their faces filled with a joy so profound that it took my breath away. "Sarah," my mother said, her voice carrying the accent and cadence that my grandmother had described to me so many times. "We've been waiting for you. We've been waiting so long." They told me what had happened that night, how beings from some other realm had come seeking souls to fill their own emptiness, how the congregation had been drawn one by one into a place between worlds, how they had remained there ever since, neither truly dead nor truly alive. "We can't move on," my father explained, his hand resting gently on my shoulder. "We're caught between what was and what should be, anchored to this place by our love for those we left behind. But if someone we love releases us, if they tell us it's time to go home to Jesus, then we can finally rest." I understood then what I had to do. I took my parents' hands and spoke the words that had been building in my heart for 50 years. "Mama, Papa, I love you, but it's time to let go. It's time to go to your reward." The entire congregation began to sing then, not the haunting, otherworldly melody that had frightened so many visitors, but "When We All Get to Heaven," sung with voices filled with joy and anticipation. As they sang, they began to fade, becoming more and more translucent, until they were nothing more than whispers of light in the darkness. The last to disappear were my parents. Before they faded completely, my mother pressed something into my hand, a locket that had belonged to her own mother, the grandmother I had never known. "For you," she whispered, "so you'll remember that love never dies, it just changes form." When the vision ended, I found myself alone in the turn, a ruined church, holding the locket and feeling a peace that I had never experienced before. The oppressive atmosphere that had hung over the place for 50 years was gone, replaced by a sense of completion and rest. Sarah Washington died in 1987, and with her death, the last personal connection to the vanished congregation was severed. But her testimony, combined with the accounts of dozens of other witnesses over the decades, paints a picture of a supernatural event that defies conventional explanation. In the years following Sarah's experience, reports of paranormal activity at the Willow Creek church site decreased dramatically. The unexplained singing stopped, the mysterious lights in the forest ceased to appear, and travelers passing through the area no longer reported the overwhelming sense of unease that had characterized the location for half a century. Today, little remains of the Willow Creek Baptist Church. The building finally collapsed completely in the 1960s, and the site is now marked only by a few foundation stones and the grove of ancient oaks that once provided shade for Sunday services. The forest has largely reclaimed the area, erasing most traces of the community that once gathered there. But the story of the missing congregation lives on in the oral tradition of the Ozark Mountains. It has become part of the folklore of the region, passed down through generations of mountain families who remember the night when 43 souls vanished from a country church and stepped out of the world. Modern investigators and paranormal researchers have occasionally visited the site, drawn by the mystery and the persistent rumors of supernatural activity. Most find nothing more than a peaceful grove of trees and the remnants of old foundation stones. But a few claim to have experienced something that connects them to the events of that October night morti, a century ago. Dr. James Mitchell, a parapsychologist from the University of Missouri, conducted a study of the site in 1991 as part of his research into reported hauntings in rural America. Using electromagnetic field detectors, infrared cameras, and sensitive audio recording equipment, he hoped to document any residual supernatural energy that might remain at the location. What we found was fascinating, Dr. Mitchell reported in his published study. While we detected no evidence of current paranormal activity, the electromagnetic readings at the site were unlike anything we had encountered before. The entire area showed evidence of what can only be described as a massive disruption in the local electromagnetic field. as if some enormous energy event had occurred there decades ago and left permanent traces in the environment. Most intriguingly, our audio equipment picked up what appeared to be voices embedded in the background electromagnetic noise. Not recent voices, but what sounded like echoes from the distant past. When we cleaned up these recordings and enhanced them, we could make out fragments of what appeared to be congregational singing, faint but unmistakably human. One recording, captured near the site of the old church foundation, included what sounded like a male voice saying, "Tell them we are still here. Tell them we are still waiting." The exact words that Dr. Sullivan reported hearing from the ghostly Thomas Hartwell in her 1925 encounter. These scientific findings, while not providing definitive proof of supernatural activity, have added credibility to the eyewitness accounts that have accumulated over the decades. They suggest that something extraordinary did indeed occur at Willow Creek on October 12, 1901, something that left traces detectable by modern scientific instruments nearly a century later. The question of what actually happened to the 43 members of the Willow Creek Baptist Church congregation remains officially unsolved. No bodies were ever found, no evidence of violence or kidnapping was ever discovered, and no rational explanation has ever been proposed that accounts for all the facts of the case. But in the oral tradition of the Ozark Mountains, the answer is clear. They were taken by forces beyond human understanding, drawn into a realm between worlds where they remained trapped until love and forgiveness finally set them free. It is a story that speaks to the deepest beliefs of the mountain people, that love transcends death, that faith can overcome any darkness, and that sometimes the greatest mysteries of life cannot be solved by investigation and logic, but only by the power of human connection across the boundaries of time and space. The legacy of the Willow Creek disappearance extends far beyond the confines of the abandoned church site. It has become a cornerstone of Ozark folklore, inspiring countless retellings, variations, and related stories throughout the region. Local historians have documented dozens of similar tales, vanishing communities, ghost congregations, and supernatural encounters, many of which seem to echo elements of the original Willow Creek incident. Some folklorists suggest that the story serves a psychological function for the isolated communities of the Ozark Mountains, providing a narrative framework for understanding the fears and anxieties that come with living in remote, sometimes dangerous territory. The tale speaks to the very real possibility that an entire community could disappear, whether through natural disaster, violence, or economic necessity, leaving behind only traces and memories. But for those who lived through the experience, either as witnesses to the supernatural events or as family members of the disappeared, the Willow Creek incident was much more than folklore. It was a tragedy that shaped their lives and their understanding of the world around them. Emma Henderson, the granddaughter of the vanished Samuel Henderson, grew up hearing stories about the grandfather she had never met. In a 1975 interview, she reflected on how the family tragedy had influenced her own faith and worldview. Growing up, I always felt like there was something missing in our family. Not just Grandpa Samuel, but something deeper. It was like there was a hole in the fabric of our history, a place where questions could never be answered and wounds could never fully heal. But as I got older, I came to understand that the story of that night wasn't really about loss. It was about love. All those people, trapped between worlds, waiting for someone to release them with forgiveness and acceptance. It taught me that death isn't the end of our connections to each other, and that sometimes the most important thing we can do for those we love is to let them go. This theme of love transcending death and the importance of letting go appears in many of the personal accounts connected to the Willow Creek incident. It suggests that the story, whether understood as literal truth or symbolic narrative, serves as a meditation on grief, loss, and the eternal bonds that connect us to those we love. The tale has also influenced the religious life of the region in subtle but significant ways. Many Ozark churches include prayers for the departed and the lost in their regular services, a tradition that some trace back to the Willow Creek disappearance. The story has become a reminder that the supernatural is never far away in the mountains, and that faith must be strong enough to contend with mysteries that reason cannot solve. In recent decades, the Willow Creek incident has attracted attention from outside the Ozark region, becoming the subject of books, documentaries, and paranormal investigations. This broader interest has brought both recognition and commercialization to the story, with some local communities embracing the attention, while others worry about the transformation of a sacred tragedy into entertainment. But regardless of how the story is interpreted or retold, its essential message remains constant. There are forces in the world that exceed human understanding, mysteries that cannot be solved by investigation alone, and connections between people that transcend the boundaries of life and death. As we stand today in the grove of ancient oaks, where the Willow Creek Baptist Church once welcomed its congregation, it's easy to imagine the events of that October night more than a century ago. The wind still whispers through the leaves with the same voice that disturbed the worshippers on their final evening together. The moon still casts shadows through the branches that dance like memories of people who once walked here in flesh and blood. And sometimes, if you listen carefully in the moments between the calling of owls and the rustling of leaves, you might still hear the distant echo of voices raised in song. Voices that remind us that some bonds are stronger than death, some mysteries deeper than investigation, and some stories too important to ever be forgotten. The tale of the Willow Creek congregation stands as a testament to the enduring power of community, faith, and love in the face of the unknowable. It reminds us that even in our modern world of scientific explanation and rational analysis, there remain corners of human experience that defy understanding, places where the supernatural touches the natural world and leaves traces that can be felt, if not fully comprehended, by those who have the courage to listen. In the end, the 43 souls who vanished from that country church on October 12, 1901, have achieved a kind of immortality. Not the tragic immortality of unsolved mystery, but the gentle immortality of a story that continues to touch hearts, challenge assumptions, and remind us that the most important truths in life often cannot be proven. They can only be believed. The sun sets now over the same Ozark hills that witnessed that long-ago tragedy, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson that would have been familiar to Thomas and Rebecca Hartwell, to their children, and to all the faithful souls who gathered that night for fellowship and worship. The mountains endure, the seasons turn, and the story lives on, a whisper in the wind, a song in the silence, a reminder that love never dies, it just changes form. And somewhere in the space between memory and eternity, perhaps the congregation of Willow Creek Baptist Church continues to sing, their voices finally free to carry their message of hope across the boundaries of time and space, telling all who will listen that faith endures, love conquers, and some gatherings are too powerful to be ended by anything as simple as death. In these ancient hills where the past and present intermingle like morning mist through the valleys, the story of the Willow Creek congregation has become more than just a tale of supernatural mystery. It has become a part of the land itself, woven into the fabric of Ozark identity, and passed down through generations like a precious inheritance. As twilight settles once again over the grove where the church once stood, we are reminded that some stories are too powerful to remain confined to the past. They live on in the telling, in the believing, and in the eternal human need to find meaning in the face of mystery. The congregation of Willow Creek Baptist Church may have stepped out of our world on that October night in 1901, but their story continues to echo through the hills they called home, a testament to the enduring power of faith, community, and love that transcends all boundaries. This story ends, but many await. Subscribe so no tale escapes you.